Son, I don't know what nursing home let you wander off the grounds, but this is Fort Benning, and you are approximately 40 years past your expiration date. The voice sliced through the humid Georgia morning like a boot heel on gravel, sharp, carrying, shaped by 10,000 hours of formation and parade ground, and the particular pleasure of a man who has learned that volume is a form of authority. Staff Sergeant Curtis Briggs stood at the edge of the reception hall threshold, with his campaign cover squared, and his boots gleaming, and his arms folded across a chest that announced itself before the rest of him did. He was 31 years old, 2 combat deployments behind him, and a third on the horizon, and he had the compact, coiled energy of a man who had been trained to believe that every room was a proving ground. The old man he was addressing did not look up. He was sitting in a folding chair along the far wall of the building, the kind of institutional chair that is uncomfortable, by design and philosophy both, with his hands resting open on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, watching something that was not in the room. His name was Walter James Colton, and he was 81 years old. He wore a plain gray work shirt, washed so many times the color had become an argument rather than a fact, and dark civilian trousers with a careful crease that had been put in by hand. His boots were black and old, and had seen Rizzoli twice. He wore no insignia, no hat, no indication of anything except a man waiting with the absolute patience of someone to whom waiting had long since ceased to be an inconvenience. On his left breast pocket, pinned through the fabric, with the careful precision of something treated as significant, was a small silver badge, a musket above a wreath, worn to a soft gunmetal patina by decades and handling. A combat infantryman badge, though nothing about the way it was worn announced itself. It simply was. His hands on his knees were the hands of a man who had used them hard and long, the knuckles like river stones, the skin thin and mapped with age, but they lay perfectly still, as if stillness were their natural condition and motion the exception. Briggs covered the distance between them in 8 deliberate steps. "Sir," the word landed with the particular weight Briggs gave it when it was not a courtesy, but a warning. Reception orientation for the 163rd Family Day started 20 minutes ago. That's in Building C. This is the Staff and Personnel Annex. You are in the wrong building, and I'm going to need you to gather yourself and move. Walter Colton raised his eyes. They were gray, those eyes, the color of clouds that have been in the sky so long they've forgotten they were ever white, and threaded through with something that had nothing to do with age. A depth that was not vacancy, but the opposite of vacancy. The kind of depth that comes from having looked at things and not looked away. They settled on Briggs with a quality the younger man would later struggle to describe accurately, because it was not challenge and was not submission and was not indifference, but was something that contained elements of all three and transcended each of them. "I'm in the right building, Staff Sergeant," Walter Colton said. His voice was low and unhurried, a gravel sound, the voice of a man who had long ago stopped needing to project. "Captain Ellard's office is down that hall. I have a 0900. You have a..." Briggs blinked. Then his expression reorganized itself around something that was not quite belief. "You have a 0900 with Captain Ellard." Yes, the word landed without ornamentation. Briggs turned his head fractionally to the 2 junior enlisted men standing near the door, PFC Daniels and Specialist Torres, both of whom had been watching with the studied neutrality of people who understand that attention in these situations can be construed as participation. He let a short, controlled exhale through his nose, the kind that substitutes for a laugh in places where laughing outright would be excessive. "Captain Ellard," he said, turning back, "is the battalion personnel officer. His 0900 roster includes me, Lieutenant Vasquez, and Sergeant First Class Monroe. It does not include, he gestured with one open hand, a gesture that encompassed the old man's civilian clothes, his age, his chair, his fundamental presence in a place Briggs had determined he did not belong. This. You might want to check with him, Walter Colton said. He had not moved. His hands remained open on his knees. Something shifted in Briggs's jaw, a tightening, a decision being made. He stepped closer, moved to the chair beside Colton's, did not sit in it but used its back as a prop, leaning down so the dynamic of height and proximity said what his regulation rank precluded him from saying directly. Let me tell you what I see, he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register, the one that bypasses audience and goes straight to subject. I see an elderly gentleman who has wandered into a restricted access facility. I see a civilian badge that does not match any current access level for this annex. And I see. His eyes moved to the combat infantryman badge. He reached out and put a finger against it, not removing it but pressing it slightly, tipping it back, examining the back pin. I see a piece of hardware that I genuinely cannot figure out. Because the issue date on this housing looks like it predates some of the men currently serving on this post. He leaned in slightly. Where'd you get this? Pops? Estate sale? Because I need you to understand, wearing military decorations without authorization is a federal. The annex fell away. The fluorescent light went first, replaced by a flat, enormous heat that had no ceiling and no source, but was simply the condition of the world. The smell of floor polish and institutional coffee dissolved into red Georgia clay and something older and more absolute, cordite and diesel, and the iron-copper smell of men who have been afraid for a very long time. He was 20 years old. He was in a ditch on the eastern approach to Porkchop Hill in the last hours before dawn, and the artillery had been going for 6 hours and showed no intention of stopping. And the man beside him, a sergeant named Roy Easterling from Meridian, Mississippi, who had a laugh like a screen door in the wind and who had been writing a letter to his mother when the barrage started, was no longer writing the letter. The ground shook with a low, continuous tremor that had stopped feeling like individual explosions and had become instead a new quality of the air, a new grammar of the world. Walter Colton, in the year 1953, 20 years old and 2 inches taller than he would be at 81, was doing the only thing available to him, which was staying low and watching the wire and waiting for the light to change. He had been given the combat infantryman badge 4 months earlier by a captain who had pressed it into his palm with 2 fingers and said, simply, "You've earned it now, son." The captain's name was Hartley. He had a wife back in Abilene whose name Walter had memorized because Hartley talked about her the way some men talk about rivers, as though she were a force that shaped everything downstream. Captain Hartley was dead by morning. He died on the upper slope in the last push before the hill changed hands for the 3rd and final time. And Walter carried him. He carried him because there was no one else to carry him, and because Hartley had the kind of face that made leaving him in the dirt of a Korean hillside feel like a crime against the general order of the universe. He carried him for 1.5 kilometers, with his own left arm bleeding from a fragment wound that had taken a piece of his forearm and deposited it somewhere in the red clay behind him. He did not know the arm was damaged in any meaningful way until a corpsman took hold of it and said, "Son, do you feel this?" And Walter said, "Feel what?" And the corpsman's face answered the question. In the aid station afterward, someone took the combat infantryman badge from his torn pocket, he had not known he was holding it, and pinned it back through the fabric of his shirt with practiced hands. He had not touched it since, without hearing the particular quality of the silence on that hillside just before the light came up and showed him what was in the grass. The room reformed. The fluorescent hum returned. The smell of floor polish came back, and the institutional chair under him, and Briggs's hand still against the badge, still pressing it back against the fabric with that forensic, dismissive fingertip. Walter Colton blinked once. "That belonged to a captain named Hartley," he said. His voice had not changed in register or pace. "He gave it to me in November of 1952. I have had it since." Briggs straightened. "Sir, I would appreciate it if you took your hand off it." From the doorway, PFC Daniels made a small, involuntary adjustment to his posture. He was 19 years old, 8 months in the Army, and he had been raised by a grandfather who had served in 2 wars and who had told him once, with a directness that had not diminished in the years since, that the measure of a man's character was exactly what he did when the room was watching, and what he did when the room was not, and that the second one was the only one that counted. Daniels watched Briggs's hand against the old man's badge. He watched the old man's face, that absolute stillness, those gray eyes with their terrible depth. He watched the way the air in the room had a quality now that it had not had 5 minutes ago, a tension like a wire pulled too tight. And he thought about his grandfather, and he thought, no. "Staff Sergeant Briggs," he said, "I need to make a run to the supply room." "Permission to step out, Sergeant." Briggs glanced at him. "Make it quick." Daniel stepped out. He did not go to the supply room. He went down the hall and around the corner to the small alcove near the water fountain where the cell signal was adequate, and he pulled out his phone, and he dialed the direct line for First Sergeant Holloway, whose number he had because First Sergeant Holloway had given it to every soldier in the company on their first week, and said, "If you ever see something wrong, and the person doing the wrong thing is in your chain, you call me," and he had not yet had occasion to use it. First Sergeant Holloway answered on the second ring. "Holloway, First Sergeant. This is PFC Daniels. I'm in the personnel annex and there's a situation with Staff Sergeant Briggs. He's got an older gentleman, a civilian, and Daniels paused, sorted the words. "He's got his hand on the man's badge, First Sergeant." The man said his name is Walter Colton and that he has a 0900 with Captain Ellard, and Briggs doesn't believe him, and the silence that followed was so sudden and so complete that Daniels pulled the phone from his ear to verify the call had not dropped. It had not dropped. 4 full seconds. When First Sergeant Holloway's voice returned, it was stripped of everything conversational, reduced to something tight and operational and moving very fast. "Daniels, say that name again." "Walter Colton, First Sergeant." Another silence, shorter, denser. "Where exactly in the annex?" "Main reception hall, First Sergeant." "South end, near thee. Do not let Staff Sergeant Briggs move that man. Do you understand me? Do not let anyone take him anywhere. Go back in there, and you stay close, and you do not let that man leave that room." The line stayed open. Daniels could hear the First Sergeant already moving. The sound of a chair, a door. His voice barking to someone else in the background. "Get me Colonel Vance's office. Right now. Tell him Walter Colton is in the personnel annex." "Yes, I said Colton. Just do it." Daniels ran back. In the G3 operations building on the far side of post, Colonel David Vance was reviewing a training rotation schedule with his S3 when his aide knocked and opened the door simultaneously, a thing the aide had never done in 2 years of service, and Vance looked up from the schedule at his aide's face and went very still. "Sir," the aide said, "First Sergeant Holloway's office says Walter Colton is in the personnel annex." Colonel Vance set down his pen. "Get me General Marsh's office," he said. He was already on his feet. "And get me a vehicle." The aide was gone before the sentence finished. In the outer office, through the wall, Vance could hear him on the phone, and he could hear the quality of the silence on the other end when the name was given, and he could hear the particular kind of controlled urgency that moves through a command structure when a name surfaces that everyone in a certain generation of the Army knows, and most people below a certain rank have never heard. Because the man who carried it did his work quietly and went home quietly and asked for nothing in the intervening decades, and the Army had not forgotten even when it seemed to have moved on. 40 miles away, at the Maneuver Center of Excellence headquarters, General Arthur Marsh was in his 4th hour of a readiness briefing when his aide-de-camp walked through the door with an expression that made the general raise one hand to halt the briefer mid-sentence. His aide bent and said 4 words. General Marsh was out of his chair. He said 3 words to his aide. He was reaching for his cover as he said them. Back in the personnel annex, Staff Sergeant Curtis Briggs had escalated. He had relocated from the folding chair to a standing position directly in front of Walter Colton, close enough that any reasonable person would understand it as a physical claim on the space. And he had produced a small notebook into which he was writing with the deliberate slowness of a man who has decided that bureaucratic process is the most effective form of force available to him. I'm going to need your full name, date of birth, and the name of whoever told you that you had a 0900 here, because I have been unable to verify. The sound came from outside. It began as a low, building thrum felt through the soles of the boots rather than heard with the ears, the synchronized baritone of military vehicle engines moving with purpose across post pavement. Then it sharpened into something more specific, the single whoop of an MP siren cutting the morning air once, cleanly, as a signal rather than a summons. Then tires on the entrance drive. Then doors. Multiple doors, not slamming but closing with the crisp, authoritative finality of people who have been trained to make even small physical actions communicate intent. Briggs looked toward the window. His pen stopped moving. Through the glass, 2 military vehicles sat at angles on the approach, a pair of soldiers in dress greens visible through the entrance doors before those doors opened. They opened without a knock. Colonel David Vance walked through first, his cover on and his expression arranged into something that was not anger, but was the quiet, dangerous precursor to it, the face of a man who has arrived somewhere already knowing what he is going to find and who has decided on the way over how he will handle it. Behind him, 2 soldiers took up positions without being directed, flanking the entrance with the economy of motion of men who have done this before. And then, 4 seconds later, through the same doors, General Arthur Marsh. 4 stars on each shoulder, dress greens with ribbons that told the story of 4 decades in the United States Army in the compressed language of colored fabric. He was 62 years old and had the posture of a man 20 years younger, not because of vanity, but because posture had long since become structural, inseparable from the architecture of who he was. He walked into the room, and his eyes moved across it, and found Walter Colton in his folding chair, and did not move again. He walked directly toward him. He did not look at Briggs. He did not acknowledge the 2 junior enlisted men standing against the wall. He did not explain his presence or preface his approach with any words at all. He walked the length of the room with his polished shoes on the linoleum, making the only sound in a space that had achieved an absolute collective stillness. And he stopped in front of the old man in the gray work shirt and the worn black boots. And he looked at the combat infantryman badge pinned to the breast pocket with the same careful, precise attention that one gives to something known to be significant. He saw where Briggs was standing. He saw the notebook. He saw the precise geography of the confrontation. A muscle in his jaw moved once. Briggs stepped back half a pace. His notebook found its way to his side. General Arthur Marsh reached up, squared his cover, drew himself to his full height, and snapped to a salute, the sharpest, most breathtakingly precise salute that Staff Sergeant Curtis Briggs had seen in 11 years of active duty, a salute that hit the brim of a 4-star general's cover like the edge of a blade and was held there, directed without ambiguity or qualification at the 81-year-old man in the folding chair. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. The salute held. PFC Daniels, standing against the wall, later said that the sound that moved through the room at that moment was the sound of everyone in it breathing in at the same time and no one breathing out. Briggs's face had gone the color of old chalk. General Marsh brought the salute down and extended his hand, and Walter Colton took it, and the handshake was brief and complete. The handshake of two men who have been in the same rooms and understand without stating it what that means. "Mr. Colton," General Marsh said, "I apologize for any difficulty this morning." Walter Colton said, "You didn't cause it, Arthur." The general turned then to face the room, and his eyes moved to Briggs with the measured quality of a man who has made several decisions before arriving at the one he is about to deliver. "Staff Sergeant Briggs," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Walter James Colton entered the United States Army in 1951. He served with the 7th Infantry Division on the Korean Peninsula, including the action at Pork Chop Hill in 1953, where he carried his company commander off that hill under direct fire with a fragment wound in his left arm that cost him full use of 2 fingers for the rest of his life. He paused, allowing the sentence to complete itself in the room's silence. He was awarded the Combat Infantryman Badge, which he has worn on that shirt for 68 years. He received the Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars, the latter with V device, meaning valor. He returned to civilian life in 1955 and has not, in the 7 decades since, made a single demand on this institution in return for what he gave it. Briggs was stone. "That badge you put your finger on," General Marsh said quietly, "was pinned to his shirt by an officer who died on the same hill where your Staff Sergeant Colton bled. And you questioned its authenticity. You let a moment pass. You will want to think carefully about what that says." The institutional consequences arrived in writing 2 days later. Staff Sergeant Curtis Briggs received a formal letter of reprimand to be filed in his permanent record, a mandatory reassignment to the installation's Senior Leader Mentorship Program, and a 30-day suspension from his current training supervisory duties, pending review. The letter used careful, measured language. The Army is precise about these things. It does not need to be excessive to be thorough. Then Walter Colton walked to where Briggs was standing. He moved across the linoleum with the unhurried deliberateness that was simply how he moved, not slowly, not with effort, but with the economy of someone who has made peace with the pace of things. He stopped in front of the younger man and placed a hand, gently, on the same shoulder where Briggs had leaned down and made his case. The inversion was quiet and complete. Briggs did not move. "You've got good fire in you," Walter Colton said. His voice had not changed since the first moment. The same low gravel, the same absence of triumph. "The Army made you that way for a reason. Fire like that has kept men alive in the dark." He let his hand rest for a moment. "Just make sure you can see what's in front of you before you decide it doesn't matter." He removed his hand. "Carry on, son." He walked down the hall to Captain Ellard's office, arrived 2 minutes past his 0900, apologized for the delay without explaining it, and sat down across the desk from a man 30 years his junior, and gave him the assessment he had come to give, a quiet, precise accounting of the training protocols he had been asked to review, delivered without preamble and without ornamentation, in the same voice he had used for everything else that morning. The morning went on. The post went on. The flags on the parade ground snapped in the Georgia wind the way they always did, without regard for what had happened inside. 8 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon in September, Briggs walked into a diner on Victory Drive, 3 blocks off Post, where he sometimes ate on weekends. He had lost something in the intervening weeks, not weight, exactly, but a kind of density, a compression of manner that had made him seem larger in a room than his actual dimensions warranted. He moved through the diner door and toward the counter and stopped. Walter Colton was in the second booth from the window, eating eggs with the same unhurried attention he gave everything. Briggs stood at the counter for a moment. Then he walked over. "Mr. Colton." His voice was not the voice from the annex. It was smaller and more honest. "I don't have an adequate way to apologize for what I said to you. I've been thinking about it for 2 months, and I still don't have the words." A pause. "I'm sorry, sir." Walter Colton looked at him with those gray eyes for a moment. Then he slid the laminated menu across the table without comment and moved his coffee to make room. Briggs sat down. They ate together in the easy quiet of 2 people who do not need to fill silence. And when Walter Colton left, he paid for both their breakfasts and walked to his truck in the September sun and drove home along a road he had driven for 30 years, through a town that had grown up around a Post that had existed before he was born. And he drove with the same unhurried rhythm he brought to everything. A man who had been somewhere and come back and found the ordinary world waiting for him, and had discovered over the course of 8 decades that the ordinary world, properly attended to, was more than enough. Some men carry the weight of entire wars in the quiet of their daily lives, and you would never know it to look at them. They sit in folding chairs and eat eggs on Saturday mornings and wear worn shirts with old badges pinned to the pocket. And they do not explain themselves, and they do not need to, and the world goes on around them the way water goes around a stone, shaped by the stone's presence even when the stone makes no sound. If you are moved by Walter's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes.